Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the parchment-lined corridors of ancient China's imperial bureaucracy, where men with tired eyes and tight buns on their heads, not their lunch trays, copied. Stamped and stored scrolls like their very lives depended on it. Because in many cases, they did. You're standing at the edge of a lamplit hallway inside the tabularium, the central records building, tucked beneath the great towers of the Forbidden City. The ceiling leaks just a little. Not from rain, but from history, so much weight pressed into paper that even the air seems to bow in reverence. Scrolls hang from pegs like sleeping bats. Ink stains pattern every desk like the nervous sweat of centuries. You're wrapped in the scent of dried bamboo fish glue in 1,000 sighs. A pigeon flaps somewhere overhead. You don't look up. A clerk passes you with a stack so high he can't see his own feet. Another squinting through the candlelight scribbles frantically. He's copying edicts onto rice paper thinner than your patience. You pass him and pause. He's writing something like all grain reserves in the Southern District must be audited by midsummer. You wonder how long ago midsummer was. The ink looks fresh, but the man looks like he's been here since the Qin dynasty. There's no glamour here. No jade dragons, no martial arts, just record keeping and fear. Because this isn't just a place to log data, it's a place where a badly phrased sentence could end a dynasty or worse, get someone reassigned to manure inspection duty in the hinterlands. You know the kind of punishment where you don't die, but you deeply wish you had. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, if you're tuning in from somewhere interesting, post your city and local time in the comments. I love seeing where these stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You keep walking, and soon enough you're shown into a side chamber. Here scrolls aren't just stacked, they're entombed. Clay tubes cradle records with titles etched so finely you're sure someone's eyes fell out writing them. Your guide, a junior clerk with the energy of a peeled radish, asks if you're here to study agricultural yield reports or celestial misalignments. You say, actually, I am here to understand why bureaucrats had pre-written panic scrolls. He nods slowly. Too slowly. Like someone trying to remember whether you're a scholar or a spy. Then he says, follow me. You do. The hallway narrows. Lamps become fewer. The floors creak a little more honestly. And then at the end of a long row marked Han Dynasty Miscellaneous. He opens a drawer and withdraws what looks like a bundle of wrinkled laundry. But it's not laundry, it's history's version of a stress ball. A panic scroll. It's shorter than a typical report. Hastily written, probably multiple copies. It starts with the words, if found, forgive this humble scribe, and ends with a rather elaborate metaphor involving fish bones and filial piety. You learn that these were unofficial, secret, whispered about between colleagues with the same tone you'd use to discuss an underground gambling ring, or an uncle who used forbidden chili oil on imperial dishes. Each scroll held a pre-scripted excuse, a backup narrative, something to buy time curry favor or fake just enough compliance to avoid being, well, replaced. See in ancient China, especially under dynasties like Han and Tang. Government officials were expected to not only manage vast districts, but also divine the emperor's will through layers of etiquette, Confucian idealism, and contradictory memos from 3 ministries ago. Imagine getting a new job where no one trains you, half the rules are oral tradition, and if you make a mistake, your entire family line has to send apology poetry. That's how life felt as an official here. So yes, panic scrolls were preparation, just in case the rice shipment didn't arrive, or a report got sent to the wrong eunuch, or gods forbid you use the wrong character for emperor and accidentally called him a goat. Historians still argue whether these scrolls were common practice or only used in specific court circles, but fragments have been found hidden inside brush boxes, tucked into sleeves, and even wrapped around food jars because if you're going to run better, bring a snack. And here's where things get strange. The quality of a panic scroll sometimes determined your future. One official legend says wrote a scroll so beautifully apologetic, so poetically humble that the emperor not only spared him, but promoted him to a job where his only task was to ghostwrite apologies for other failing officials. So while the scrolls were born from anxiety, they were also a strange kind of currency. You reach out and unroll one yourself. The ink is faint, the brushwork uneven. The message is clear. Rain fell too heavily. River breached. Barley washed away. This humble servant sent for backup but was struck with illness. Request leniency. Will fast for 7 days in repentance. The date is 3 weeks before the river breach was even reported. And yet, there's a fingerprint in the margin. A thumbprint pressed in ink. Proof that the writer thought he might need it. Proof that in the world of ancient administration, being prepared wasn't just smart, it was survival. You roll the scroll back up and replace it with care. Behind you, another clerk sneezes loudly, and then resumes copying characters for Peasant Rebellion. No one reacts. It's just another day at the archives. You leave the tabularium's shadows behind, stepping once again into the full sensory assault of Imperial Rome, sorry, Beijing. Because here in the Han capital, the difference between a bustling street and a bureaucratic mind meld is really just a matter of signage and incense. You're walking now toward the Ministry of Rights, an ancient department that sounds dignified, but mostly specialized in making sure officials bowed at the right angle, used the correct silk thread count in court robes, and didn't accidentally offend heaven. And you start to realize in ancient China, administration wasn't just about taxes or maps, it was cosmology with paperwork. Everything had to harmonize earth and sky grain quotas and zodiac alignments, ink stroke and intention. If you were a low-ranking official, even your brush technique could be audited. And heaven help you if your character for Harvest looked too much like disaster. Today, the ministry is preparing for an imperial inspection, which means you see panic in motion. Clerks racing through halls with scrolls like torches, someone scrubbing a brass plaque that hasn't seen soap since the Zhou dynasty. 2 senior officials in russet robes, arguing over whether a ceremonial fan should tilt left or right during the welcoming gesture. The answer obviously is both and neither, and perhaps you should meditate on it for a few hours while fasting. A young aide offers you tea that smells like regret and fermented plum. You accept out of politeness and sip it cautiously. It tastes like bureaucracy if that could be steeped and served lukewarm. A gong sounds, not loud, just enough to make everyone flinch. The Emperor, or more likely his proxy, is arriving. You're ushered to the edge of a side hallway. You press yourself against the wall, trying not to look suspicious or important or alive. The procession that passes is stately, measured. Every footfall lands in rhythm, but your eyes aren't on the silken banners or the lacquered sedan chair. They're on the aides trailing behind each, holding scrolls against their chest like shields. These are the sanctioned messages, the official words, and you know behind those scrolls are others. Unsanctioned, tucked in sleeves, hidden behind a veneer of calm. Historians still argue whether these inspections were more formality than substance, but records do confirm a surprising number of sudden retirements immediately afterward. One scholar dubbed it administrative natural selection. Another just called it Tuesday. Later, after the procession disappears and the palace relaxes its spine, you find a clerk willing to talk. His name is Min. He's 30 but looks older. He has the energy of a man who's written 1,000 reports and knows none were read. You ask him, how do you prepare for something like that? He doesn't answer right away. Instead, he opens his desk and pulls out a small scroll wrapped in twine. You don't ask. You know what it is. He unwinds it slowly. The brushwork is neat, not perfect, but practiced. It says, due to unforeseen pestilence among the rice paddies, this office was unable to fulfill the spring census. Additional efforts will be made by winter. This servant takes full responsibility and has already shaved his head in symbolic penance. You look at Min's head. He's wearing a hat. It's metaphorical, he says. You nod solemnly. He rolls the scroll back up and tucks it into a hollow bamboo pen shaft. Ingenious. The trick, he says, is writing it like you've already been forgiven. Not begging. Just resigned. The good ones read like a weather report. Another clerk leans over and mutters something about a man who once filed 6 panic scrolls in advance, each tailored to a different disaster drought. Locusts, bandits, budget cuts, ghost sighting, and too much rain. He was promoted twice, which raises a new thought. These weren't just emergency tools, they were a kind of resume. If you could anticipate crisis well enough to apologize before it arrived, You weren't failing, you were managing expectations. Min tells you the panic scroll tradition likely started during the early Han period, but flourished in the Tang dynasty when literacy among officials reached new heights, and bureaucratic paranoia became practically its own virtue. Tang men, he says, feared two things being forgotten and being remembered too vividly. You ask if the scrolls ever worked. He shrugs. Depends who reads them. Depends what the stars say. Depends if your cousin works in personnel. And that's when it clicks. This isn't a system built for clarity or efficiency. It's built for theater. Every decree is a script. Every inspection a performance. And every official from the highest advisor to the humblest scribe is playing a role written by fear tradition and the knowledge that even the best performance might get cut in rewrites. A gong sounds again. This time lunch. Min stands. Time to reheat the porridge and revise history. You thank him and step back into the sunlit courtyard. Birds chirp. Someone sneezes. You wonder how many scrolls will get written about today. You follow the curve of a shaded corridor trailing the scent of boiled millet and the dry rustle of paper on paper. The air grows thick with the mustiness of stored records, the kind that settle into your lungs and make you feel like you've just inhaled far 100 years of tax disputes. You're headed to a different corner of the administrative maze now. Somewhere quieter. Older. The Archive of Disciplinary Memorials, an unassuming title that essentially means the place where panic goes to die. Here the panic scrolls live. The real ones. Not the preemptive drafts tucked into sleeves or hidden behind bamboo pen shafts. These are the ones that were submitted, sealed, cataloged, reviewed by high officials, then quietly bound into volumes for historical insight, which in practice means evidence. You step through the doorway and find a room lined wall-to-wall with wooden shelves, each stacked with scrolls, bundled in faded cloth and tagged with dates. The clerk on duty is ancient, translucent, and possibly carved from sandalwood. He looks up when you enter and without speaking gestures to a set of scrolls labeled Zhenguan Reign Year 9. You take one at random. It creaks when unrolled. It begins to the heavenly mandate embodied in the person of our august emperor this humble servant confesses. And then it spirals into apologies for the failure of the regional granary to prevent mold the death of 2 pigs, due to a collapsed fence and the mysterious disappearance of 39 baskets of dried fish. 39, not 40, not 30, 39. Someone counted. You can almost feel the writer's heartbeat in the brushstrokes. There's a certain rhythm to bureaucratic fear, flowery flattery, awkward honesty, carefully inserted blame shifting, and finally the humble offer of resignation, which was rarely accepted unless politically convenient. You open another scroll. This one's angrier. It starts polite, but by paragraph 2 it's clear the author has had enough. He's tired of the governor interfering with grain allocations of the absurd weight of ceremonial reporting, and especially of the fact that his office receives candles that are too short and prone to guttering. It ends with a line that deserves framing. If heaven judges by practicality, let me be known not for my ink, but my pigs. You wonder if he got fired. Historians still argue whether these memorials were effective as a genuine means of reform, or simply a polite exit strategy bureaucratic harakiri dressed in metaphors. You roll the scrolls back up with more reverence than before. Because you realize something, these documents aren't just evidence of failure, they're deeply human. Confessions crafted under pressure. Tiny paper lifeboats tossed into an ocean of imperial judgment. Back outside, you walk past a pair of junior officials huddled in conversation, speaking in tones just above whispers. Did you hear about the magistrate in Xi'an? No, what used the wrong character for abundance. Accidentally implied the emperor's virtue was decaying fruit. Oh no. He's been reassigned to canal dredging. They both shudder. You keep walking. Further down the path, you spot a wall plastered with notices, public edicts, lists of promoted officials, and one particularly smug poem praising the glory of mulberry trees and bureaucratic metaphors. And then you see it. Pinned delicately, as if no one wanted to take responsibility for removing it, is a panic scroll on display. It's famous, you learn later. Submitted anonymously during the late Tang. Legend has it, the writer was a junior official overwhelmed by the rising quota expectations for silk taxes, compounded by a massive flood. A lice outbreak and an outbreak of birds pecking at granaries. It begins with the line, "If this office survives, it will not be from diligence but from divine comedy." and ends with "I have no pigs left to bribe you with. Please send rice." The scroll went viral in an 8th century kind of way. No one ever discovered who wrote it, but copies were made, jokes were added, and eventually it was accepted as part of the internal staff training curriculum under creative responses to policy crisis. It's all deeply absurd, but also understandable, because these weren't just scribes and clerks. They were people operating in a system that prized harmony above all else, even when the crops failed, even when the river gods didn't answer, even when the rice fungus had better job security than you did. You walk past a man arguing with a tortoise in a shallow fountain, probably metaphorically, and enter a courtyard where a group of students are practicing calligraphy. They're writing model scrolls. Apologies, confessions. Some are creative, others rigid. But all are practicing the same skill: how to fail with honor. How to present collapse wrapped in courtesy. A teacher leans over and critiques a line. "Too poetic," she says. "If the emperor cries from your scroll, it must be from respect, not laughter." One student raises his hand. "Can we use metaphor? Only if it implies humility, not sarcasm." Another asks, "What if it's actually the governor's fault?" The teacher doesn't hesitate. "Then make it sound like yours, that's safer." You sit down for a moment and watch their brushes dance across parchment. There's an art to it, an elegance to the performance of accountability. Because even in failure, a well-written scroll could grant protection, could stall judgment, could buy just enough time for the floodwaters to recede or the governor to fall out of favor. One boy finishes his draft and reads it aloud to his friend. "Due to excessive wind and the poor construction of my roof, the grain supplies have been reduced to a disappointing mush. I take responsibility for not anticipating the tantrum of the sky." They both giggle. You smile, because sometimes that's all you can do. You wander from the courtyard, trailing the soft scrape of sandals on sun-warmed stone, and head downhill toward a quieter section of the city, a place where bureaucracy takes off its official robes and pulls on something a little more domestic. A small district dedicated to record-keeping households, scribal apprenticeships, and those curious individuals known as letterbringers. These weren't messengers in the galloping horse sense. No, these were slow, thoughtful deliverers of bad news in beautiful handwriting, and their business was booming. The first man you meet is seated cross-legged on a shaded stoop, hunched over a bamboo scroll and humming what sounds like a lullaby. He's painting the characters with exquisite care. Not because the message demands reverence, but because panic scrolls were sometimes reviewed for handwriting before they were reviewed for content. Yes, imagine bearing your soul to the emperor only for a clerk to frown at your stroke angles. You watch as he adds a final brushstroke with the delicacy of a man finishing a prayer. He fans the ink gently. Then, without looking up, he says, "You want to see the museum, don't you?" You blink. "What museum?" He smiles, eyes still down. "The Hall of Mistakes. Of course you do. It's not far. Just past a grove of bent cypress trees and a wall painted with ancient slogans like, 'A clean desk reflects a clean mind and never underestimate the wind.' The Hall of Mistakes isn't grand. It doesn't need to be. It's a small windowless room lined with scrolls mounted like trophies, each one preserved for what it did wrong. You step inside. The air smells of lacquer and embarrassment. The first scroll you see opens with a flourish, with the clarity of the stars and the sharpness of a farmer's hoe. "I offer my truth." So far, so good. But then comes a miswritten character. A single slip intended to say modest, it instead says decapitated. The tone of the letter changes rather dramatically after that. Historians still argue whether the error was deliberate sabotage by a junior scribe, or simply an ink blot gone rogue. You move to the next. This one was rejected not for its content, but for overuse of metaphor. Apparently describing the emperor's patience as longer than a river of noodles was deemed culturally confusing and possibly disrespectful. One scroll features 17 separate references to weather gods, but neglects to mention the actual flood it was reporting on. And in the corner, under a faded placard reading cautionary epic, hangs a scroll of over 1,800 characters, all written as a single sentence. It's less an apology and more a bureaucratic fever dream, filled with increasingly frantic clauses and exactly 3 commas. You pause in front of it, letting your eyes wander through its looping madness. The curator, an elderly woman in teal robes, shuffles over. That one was submitted by a provincial accountant during the Han Dynasty. No punctuation, no paragraph breaks. Just sheer existential dread on parchment. You ask what happened to him. She shrugs. He was promoted, briefly. You leave the Hall of Mistakes with a sense of awe and dread. Because panic scrolls you're beginning to realize weren't just about fear. They were performances. A chance to prove not just honesty, but cleverness. Courage, yes, but also grammar. And sometimes a truly outstanding metaphor about millet storage. You follow the narrow alleyways until the city opens again, revealing one of the oldest post stations. Here officials and messengers from all over the empire pause to eat sleep and dispatch their scrolls onward, carried by footcart or relay pigeon depending on the budget. Inside the station house it's quiet. A man in saffron robes is napping beside a pile of sealed messages. His head rests on a scroll labeled Imperial Brick Quota Discrepancy. Urgent. You slip past him and examine the wall map. It's a wooden board carved with the delivery routes of the empire. Red lines trace mountain passes, blue lines follow rivers, and black ones cut across deserts. Every major province has a little painted icon representing its bureaucratic specialty. Luoyang tax complaints, Nanjing poetry evaluations, Xi'an turnip-based hysteria. That last one might be unofficial. You find a drawer marked Returned Scrolls and open it. Inside are messages that never made it. Some water-damaged, others clearly unopened. One bears the haunting message sender relocated to unknown district. No forwarding address. You wonder how many stories ended this way. Not with punishment, not with exoneration, just silence. Lost scrolls, forgotten names. A junior courier wanders in with a half-eaten peach and nods toward the pile. Most of these were panic scrolls. People trying to explain something just before it got worse. Did it work, you ask? He chews thoughtfully. Sometimes. You leave the station and make your way toward the Temple of Paper. That's not its real name. But everyone calls it that. It's a small shrine dedicated to Wencheng Wang, the patron deity of literature and civil servants. Legend says he once disguised himself as a records clerk to test an official's honesty. The official passed. Barely. Inside the shrine, the air is sweet with incense and dry ink. Offerings line the altar brushes, wax seals rice paper folded into cranes. One child kneels at the base, holding up a toy scroll wrapped in red ribbon. You light a stick of incense and whisper the smallest of prayers. Not for success, not for praise. Just for clarity, for one clean sentence. One undropped scroll. One less disaster that needs explaining. Back outside, a clerk rushes past you, clutching a bundle of scrolls like newborn kittens. His robes are askew and he's muttering under his breath. Format first, compliment second, blame third. Never the emperor, never the weather. Always yourself. You smile. Because that's the real magic of the panic scroll. It turns terror into structure, chaos into form. It's an art, a tradition, and maybe a little spell against the end of the world. You pass through the back alleys behind the Temple of Paper, your fingers trailing along clay walls, etched with forgotten graffiti student poems, petty insults, and once a shockingly detailed drawing of a bureaucrat being eaten by a scroll. Someone has added a speech bubble. I should have double-checked the margins. The street opens into a courtyard lined with columns painted red and gold, their lacquer worn thin by sun and petitions. This is the outer office of the Grand Secretariat, the place where mid-level clerks swam upstream through rivers of documentation, hoping to surface at the right desk before drowning in revisions. Here you witness the ritual of scroll triage. 3 officials sit on woven mats behind low desks, each with an open basket beside them labeled, Reviewed Return to Sender. And whose idea was this? They sort with the speed of veteran gamblers' eyes, flicking from seal to signature brush to paper, before slapping a scroll into its fate. One in russet robes pauses over a particularly thick message, squints, snorts, and drops it into return to sender with the words, "Too much passive voice." Yes, that mattered. You edge closer watching them work. It's oddly beautiful. The way their hands move in tandem. The brief murmurs. The snap of silk ribbons being retied. One scroll crinkles as it lands in the third basket. Its wax seal is shaped like a chicken. You don't ask. Instead, you find a bench under a flowering plum tree and sit. The petals drift like slow confetti settling on your lap, your sandals, your thoughts. Across from you, a man paces with a scroll pressed to his chest like it's trying to escape. He looks up. Do you know how many drafts I've written? You raise an eyebrow. 7, he says. This one is just the introduction. I haven't even gotten to the famine. You ask what it's about. He inhales deeply. How a supply error turned 20 sacks of millet into 600 barrels of bean paste. You nod solemnly. A classic. He throws his arms up. Do I apologize for the beans? Do I celebrate the surplus? I wrote a haiku at one point. But my supervisor said it lacked emotional accountability. You offer him a piece of candied ginger from your pocket. He takes it. He calms. Historians still argue he says chewing whether emotion was appropriate in official reports. Some say passion undermines objectivity. Others think a weeping clerk is just more honest. He leaves shortly after scroll in hand, headed for the editor's circle. You stay watching the sun shift shadows on the stone. After a while, a young apprentice approaches you. Barely more than a child dressed in indigo robes, slightly too big for him, he bows and holds out a folded square of paper. You open it. Inside is a miniature diagram of a model panic scroll, annotated in neat, tiny characters. Opening blessing. Must mention Emperor's radiance or risk accusation of rudeness. Framing context. Describe problem, avoid emotional collapse in first 30 characters. Admission of fault. Accept blame early. If fault lies with others, phrase it like you were supposed to stop them. Proposed solution. Specific, humble, slightly ambitious. Include grain math. Closing flattery. Praise. Emperor's celestial wisdom. Mention past dynastic patience for tone balance. You ask where he learned this. He points over his shoulder to a stern-faced woman in teal with a chalkboard and a stack of bamboo slips. Panic scroll school, you guess. He nods. Prep course. You glance again at the diagram, suddenly aware of how formulaic it all is. There's beauty in that, too. Even in fear, there's structure. A ritual of anxiety passed down like a family dumpling recipe fold, this way seasoned with sincerity, steam over moderate embarrassment. You return the paper with a nod, and then you're off again through a narrow passage that smells faintly of sesame oil and fresh ink, toward a building known by the wonderfully contradictory name, the Hall of Soft Curses. It's where scrolls were rewritten. Not edited, not proofread. Rewritten. Line by agonizing line. By candlelight. On newer parchment. With better ink. Under the supervision of someone whose job title might as well have been Professional Disappointment in Human Form. You step inside. The room is hushed, filled with the sound of brushes over paper and the occasional muffled sob. Scrolls hang drying like prayer flags above the heads of their creators. One man is erasing a section with a damp cloth and murmuring to himself, "No one said flood twice." That's redundant. That's weak. A woman at the front desk is stamping parchments with a jade seal shaped like a goose. You ask her what the seal means. Certifies that the scroll is readable and unlikely to cause an interprovincial incident, she replies. Also, the goose is my personal touch. He has a name. Don't ask. You don't. Instead, you take in the room. The flickering lanterns. The brushes lined like soldiers. The little wooden signs above each workstation. Less metaphor. No hyperbole until after the ration math. Avoid the word unprecedented. You think of how many panicked minds have sat here. Sweating. Scratching. Rewriting history in miniature, hoping for mercy in meter and grammar. You wonder how many scrolls made it. How many changed anything? And how many just gave their writers a little peace? The sky outside is bright now. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crows again, probably the same smug one from yesterday. You take one last glance at the Hall of Soft Curses, then step out into the light. You're beginning to understand. This isn't just about fear of punishment. It's about the hope that maybe if you tell your story well enough, someone will listen. You walk slowly now, not because your feet are tired, though they are, but because your mind is crowded with ink. With seals and scrolls and scribes whose emotional states could be measured in syllable counts. Your pace matches the rhythm of thought, slow and curious as you meander toward a quieter part of the city. And here, tucked behind a silkworm hall and an abandoned bell foundry, is something rare, a bureaucratic shrine. It's not marked as such. No grand arches, no dragons or heavenly tablets. Just a squat brick building with an open courtyard, a few clay incense burners, and a wooden statue of a man, sitting cross-legged with a brush in one hand and a resigned frown on his carved face. You blink. That frown is familiar. An elderly caretaker, his robes patched, but clean shuffles forward. That's Prefect Han, he explains, gesturing to the statue with a nod of gentle reverence. First to invent the passive-aggressive memo. You arch an eyebrow. Really? Well, historians still argue whether it was Han or someone from the Wei dynasty. But Han's the one who signed everything, as you no doubt recall, Noble Superior. So we honor him here. You step closer. The shrine isn't grand, but it's sincere. Offerings have been left wax seals, burnt brush tips, folded scroll ends tied with twine. Someone's even placed a cup of lukewarm tea with a biscuit beside the statue. You ask what people pray for here? The old man shrugs. Forgiveness, extensions, a second chance at grammar. He lights a stick of incense and tucks it into a sand basin. The smoke curls upward like a misplaced sigh. You follow suit, lighting your own. The moment is quiet grounding. It's hard to feel heroic here, but maybe that's the point. This isn't the shrine of dragons or storm gods. It's a shrine for the people who tried their best, failed with style, and begged for a footnote. Back outside, the wind picks up, stirring a line of drying laundry strung between two balconies. Among the fluttering cloth, you spot a strange banner painted with a long, bureaucratic proverb. A scroll delayed is not a scroll denied unless denied in triplicate. You smirk. That tracks. You continue on down a path lined with pebble mosaic toward the Academy District, where apprentices train for Imperial exams. Not just essays and history, but ethics, clarity, penmanship, and most importantly, not panicking in prose. You arrive at a courtyard surrounded by open study halls. Inside, young men in teal or saffron robes crouch over bamboo slips, eyes narrowed in sweaty determination. You watch as one recites aloud, "If the grain tax fails, cite the weather. If the weather fails, cite improper interpretation of astronomical signs. If all else fails, cite historic precedent and pray." A teacher claps his hands. No prayer until section 5. There's laughter. Not much, but enough to soften the tension. You're invited to sit in on a class labeled Tone Management in Crisis Scrolls. It's taught by a scholar who looks like he hasn't blinked since the last dynasty. He greets the group with a scroll held up like a holy text. This, he says, was written during the great storage collapse of the second year of Azure Grain. Note the structure it begins with. Reverence pivots into apology, ends with reassurance. He reads aloud. Your radiance bathes the realm. Regrettably, the warehouse roof was eaten by squirrels. Yet as squirrels are part of the natural order, we accept this cosmic critique. Repairs are underway. May your digestion remain untroubled. You try not to laugh. You fail. So does the student next to you who's scribbling squirrel contingency clause in the margin of his notes. The professor continues. Remember, bureaucratic elegance isn't about deception. It's about survival. It's about saying what you must without inviting execution. It's linguistic judo. He pauses, and now he says, write your own. You're handed brush ink and parchment. The prompt is brutal. A shipment of gold was accidentally melted into soup. Justify this. You glance around. One student writes, the culinary metaphor became literal through divine misalignment. Another simply writes, at least the pot is rich. You do your best. It involves alchemy optimism and a redefinition of liquidity. The professor reads it. He nods. Not bad, he says, but next time add a footnote blaming the stars. You thank him. You leave the courtyard feeling a little braver. And then the whispering starts. You pass by a tiled wall where students gather in secret to swap rejected drafts. Scrolls too honest, too poetic, too sarcastic. They've been copied and hidden here like a forbidden library of panic prose. You skim one. To his benevolence, the fire was symbolic, the damage minimal, the chickens intentional. Another reads, your servant reports that the flood, though deeply inconvenient, offered fish to many. You're struck by the voices. Not just scared clerks, but clever people. Creative, anxious, tired. People who carried the empire's weight not in armor, but in sentences. You sit for a while, letting the scrolls flutter gently in the breeze, each one a discarded lifeline. A student joins you. He's young, maybe 16 ink, smudged across his chin like war paint. He holds up a scroll and asks if you want to hear his favorite line. You nod. He recites, even the oxen refuse the census. We admire their conviction. You both laugh. He shrugs. It got him reassigned to pig inventory. You stand brushing dust from your robe and offer your thanks. He bows and returns to class. And you walk on. Because somewhere nearby there's a record keeper who once cataloged 27 types of ink. A tax clerk who calculated population based on tofu consumption. A papermaker who started encoding his love poems into scroll margins because the forms were going out anyway. And you want to meet them all, because bureaucrats may not win wars, but they remember them, and they write them down. Your sandals crunch lightly on stone as you leave the academy district behind, wandering toward the archives. Not the pristine state-sponsored ones, but the private repositories hidden in dusty alleyways where old documents go to quietly decay among whispers and spider silk. The one you're looking for is known as the Ink House. It's not marked on any public ledger, and its front gate looks more like the entrance to a crumbling tea shop than a place that holds centuries of bureaucratic panic. But when you duck through the door, it becomes immediately clear that this building is holy ground for lovers of paper. The air is thick with age and mulberry pulp. Scrolls lean against every available surface. Some are stacked neatly. Some are bound with silken cord. Many are just flopped, wherever the last reader gave up. The walls are lined with cubby holes, each packed with records so old they've turned a shade of parchment beige only achieved through centuries of careful neglect. At a rickety desk sits an old woman whose hair has gone completely white, but whose eyes are still sharp as knife points. She doesn't look up. You're here for the crisis scroll, she says. You nod before you even finish blinking. Top right shelf, under the red cat. Don't move him. He bites. You glance up. Sure enough, a rather judgmental red-furred cat is draped over a stack of bamboo slips. He gives you a slow blink that radiates administrative disapproval. You retrieve a stack just beside him. What you hold are not official records. These are drafts. Abandoned memos, rejected dispatches, some written in blood-brown ink, some in charcoal, some in a style best described as frantic whispering through brushstrokes. You unroll one. To the inspector of Eastern granaries, regretfully, no mice were caught. In unrelated news, there are fewer mice. Another to his gracious authority. The shipment arrived intact but departed differently. We interpret this as a metaphor. You try to stifle your snort. You fail. The cat twitches an ear in judgment. The old woman hears it anyway. Some of the best writing in the Empire never made it past a prefect's elbow, she murmurs half to herself. Too honest, too strange, too human. She rises slowly, spine curved like a crescent moon, and shuffles toward you with a scroll wrapped in oiled silk. This one, she says, unwrapping it gently, was written during the year of floating chickens. You blink. Come again. She waves a hand. Flooding so bad chickens learn to swim. Apparently. You peer at the scroll? To the provincial overseer. The waters are high. The roosters now crow at fish. We request boats, or at least taller roosts. You stare at her. She shrugs. The official version was less poetic. You sit together by a low, lacquered table, sipping watery tea from cracked porcelain cups. She tells you stories not the kind that show up in textbooks, but the ones passed quietly from archivist to archivist. The kind that stick to memory like stubborn glue, like the tax form that included an apology for terrible handwriting. Or the census scroll where one village listed a goat as both a resident and a taxpayer. Or the rebellion that was nearly sparked over a change in ink supplier. Historians still argue, she says, slowly swirling the tea, whether that revolt was about taxes or taste. But I say ink is personal. You nod solemnly. Because you get it now. These scrolls, these jokes, these complaints, they're more than footnotes. They're how the Empire breathed. Later, as you prepare to leave, she hands you one last scroll. No one remembers who wrote it, she says. But it's the best panic scroll I've ever read. You open it. To the Honorable Inspector. There is no rice. There is no millet. There is only sorrow and 17 turnips with ambitions far above their station. You blink. She grins. For a moment, time folds in on itself, and you're not in ancient China or some archival dreamscape. You're just one human recognizing another through shared absurdity. You bow. She bows lower. And then you slip back into the street where the afternoon sun casts every tile in gold and shadow. You head toward the Canal District. Because while paper may record history, it's food that fuels it. And if you're going to understand how these fragile scrolls held up an entire empire, you need to see what fed the people who wrote them. You arrive just in time to witness the delivery boats docking, each one stacked with baskets, jars, and crates of everything from cabbage and carp to tofu and, of course, turnips. You help an old porter unload sacks of fermented bean paste. He grunts gestures to your scroll and mutters, "Can't eat ink?" You nod, but it helps people eat. He considers that. Then he sneezes, and a rat darts from the hull into a drain, possibly carrying a receipt. You follow the flow of workers toward the market kitchens where state scribes once dined beside merchants and where even a panic-stricken letter writer could find relief in broth. The smell is glorious. Soy, ginger, vinegar, and somewhere unmistakably the buttery earthiness of stewed turnip. You buy a bowl and sit by the canal dipping slices of bread into broth, darkened by age and salt. You take a bite. It tastes like worry softened into warmth. And you finally understand what the old archivist meant. Because this isn't just stew. This is a moment of peace for a man who's about to report missing taxes. It's the last bite a courier takes before riding off with a scroll he didn't write. It's the flavor of resilience served in a cracked bowl beside a muddy river. You drink deeply, and your mind, like the broth, begins to settle. You wipe your fingers on the sleeve of your robe, not because it's polite, but because everyone else is doing it, and it seems like the cultural thing to do. The canal breeze stirs the steam from your bowl, lifting it into the sky like a silent offering to the gods of low-sodium survival. Then someone shouts your name. Except it isn't your name, it's a title. Yeah, old records inspector. You turn. A boy no older than 12, barefoot and squinting in the light waves, a folded scroll over his head like a prize chicken. He sprints toward you with the full-body velocity only possible when a child's had too much sweet rice. You're the new audit courier, right? He gasps, handing you the scroll. They said you'd be tall and confused. Accurate. You accept the scroll, which is tied with fraying twine and smells faintly of pickled radish. Who's it from? He shrugs. The tax house, or maybe a tavern. I didn't read it. I'm a respectable boy. You nod gravely and tip him a copper. He salutes, then cartwheels away into the crowd, which does not seem particularly alarmed. You unroll the message. The calligraphy is nervous brushstrokes, jittery margins, slightly drunk. It reads, "To the Imperial Record Authority, temporary replacement." This is not a bribe, this is a suggestion. If you destroy the tax code updates from the Office of Brick Storage, I will name my next child after you. Respectfully, F. You pause, you look around. No one seems to be watching. You fold the scroll and tuck it into your sleeve. Just in case. You finish the stew. And then as the sun leans lower and the shadows grow longer, you head toward the Hall of Rice and Silence. Yes, that's its real name. It's an old stone-faced building once used for emergency grain negotiations and unofficially for shouting at walls when policy collapsed. Now it holds retired clerks who spend their days reading old ledgers and debating whether the decimal system was a moral failing. Inside it smells like dust, misfiled hope, and roasted tea. You're ushered into a low-ceilinged room filled with long scroll racks and short men with long opinions. One of them adjusts his spectacles and motions you forward. You've seen the panic scrolls, he says. Now see what came after. You sit cross-legged. He slides you a scroll. Memo to all prefectures. Please disregard all previous instructions. The rice is not cursed. It is merely damp. Another. Following the loss of all fishing nets during the storm, we suggest a diet high in duckweed. It's green. That's all we can promise. You're barely a few lines in when he hands you another. This one is different. It's not panicked. It's not sarcastic. It's quiet. To the Minister of Provisions, I regret to report that my district's granary was raided not by bandits or flood, but by hunger. Our people broke the doors themselves. I will not arrest them. You blink. The old clerk exhales, folds his arms, and says, historians still argue whether this prefect was executed, demoted, or quietly promoted to somewhere rice grew better. You ask what he thinks. He shrugs. I think he went hungry too. He motions to another scroll. Directive to scribes. In future correspondence, do not include personal observations. Do not describe the faces of the hungry. Do not mention weeping. He looks at you, one eyebrow lifted. So of course he adds they wrote more vividly than ever. It's a pattern you begin to see the worse things got, the more poetic the scribes became. In between reports of grain deficits and missing tax receipts are lines of aching, unintended beauty. The beans have vanished. The soil tastes like regret. The well is a place for remembering. Or, we built a new storehouse with wood that creaks like old women. The rats refuse to move in. Even they doubt our harvest. You ask if these lines were ever published, if they were saved in annals or carved into stone. He laughs. Of course not. They were copied down secretly, whispered at night, hidden in dictionaries. That's how we keep history warm. You nod once more, humbled. Outside, the city is folding itself into twilight. The air turns from golden to plum. The streets grow quieter, save for a dog barking at his own echo, and a rice vendor yelling about discounts no one believes. You leave the Hall of Rice in silence and turn down a narrow alley, unsure exactly where you're going, but entirely confident you're supposed to find it. And you do. A shop, tiny, forgotten, with a sign that simply reads, "Things we were told not to save." Inside, a man is dusting a broom with another smaller broom. You ask if he has scrolls. He nods. Yes. You ask if they're official. He snorts. Heavens, no. He brings you a bundle wrapped in old linen. Inside are the oddest scrolls you've ever seen. One is written entirely in poetry about taxes. Another is a recipe for survival porridge with footnotes. A third is labeled instructions in the event of celestial disappointment. You open that one. If the stars vanish, continue farming. If the moon turns red, avoid legal disputes. If the sun fails, eat pickled things and write kindly to your neighbors. You ask who wrote them. He shrugs, no one important, so everyone. You leave a coin. He refuses it. Says you've already paid with time. Back on the main road, you pass a line of bureaucrats in faded robes headed home from whatever disaster they managed to not solve today. One drops a scroll. You pick it up. It reads, "Please forgive the delay. I misplaced time." You smile, return it, and keep walking. Because in this empire of ink and worry, you are beginning to see the pattern. It isn't just the scrolls that matter. It's the people who wrote them. And the fact that they did. Even when no one wanted them to. You're back on the main avenue now, that wide stone-paved artery of bureaucratic life where every sandal scuff sounds like a sigh, and every official robe seems one fold away from a nervous breakdown. You pass an elderly couple bickering over whether a particular cabbage was worth its tax levy, a monk gently chiding a street dog for existing too loudly, and a boy chasing his own kite, which is currently wrapped around the head of a very patient ox. And above it all, the faint scent of something charred and sweet. You follow it. Because why not? It leads you surprisingly not to a market, but to a government office. The Department of Agrarian Documentation, to be specific. A brick building so uninspired it could be mistaken for a wall with delusions of grandeur. A wooden plaque hangs outside its inscription, half faded. Here we preserve the yield and forget the hunger. Inside, it's quiet in that fragile way paper makes things quiet. Scrolls line the walls, some so old they've curled like sleeping cats. Others so new they practically hum with bureaucracy. You're here for one reason: the emergency procurement reports. They're famous. Infamous. The documents drafted in sheer panic when crops failed, boats sank, or someone forgot that ducks weren't supposed to eat the census records. You're handed one by a clerk whose expression suggests she'd rather be anywhere else, including a battlefield. It's labeled, "Winter Response Year of the Frost Ox." You open it. To all districts, in light of the recent grain thefts and the suspicious beet shortages, officials may now requisition emergency root reserves. Suggested phrasing: a patriotic contribution of starchy confidence. You blink. You read further. Note: if confronted by mobs, maintain calm. Offer boiled turnips as distraction. If unsuccessful, consider joining mob temporarily to gain trust. You look up. The clerk shrugs. Didn't work. But at least it's recorded. She hands you another inventory of improvised storage facilities. The list includes abandoned bathhouses, theaters between performances, temples with deity consent preferred, cartographer basements if maps are not food-themed. You chuckle. Historians still argue the clerk offers whether these records reflect genuine protocol or desperate satire. You ask her opinion. I think the ink smells like tears, she replies, and turns back to stamping something labeled confidently incomplete. You make your way deeper into the office, past an archivist asleep inside a basket of barley samples, until you reach a long room filled with scroll cabinets marked with seasons: spring, summer, autumn, and winter. Winter has twice the space. You pull one scroll at random. It reads, "Experiment mixing ground radish with vinegar to simulate pickled fish flavor. Result, vomiting." Another: on the 7th day without rice, one child insisted on naming a turnip and refused to eat it. Turnip now honored with incense. You pause. You wonder if the turnip got a name. Then you find it. Official addendum turnip designated as Old Squinty. Not to be disturbed. You exhale slowly. There's a warmth here that wasn't in the math-heavy ledgers or the tax debates. A different kind of truth. The one too odd to be fully invented and too heartfelt to be entirely ignored. Back outside, the sun tilts toward late afternoon. Shadows spill across the stone like spilled ink, and the city starts to hum with the business of people preparing to stop doing business. You make your way to the outer wall gardens, a strange little patch of green wedged between two minor fortifications, and a shrine to someone who may or may not have been a cat. There you find them, the Bureau of Experimental Agriculture, also known only semi-jokingly as the Department of Really Weird Farming Ideas. Their mission, to anticipate food crises by testing strange crops and stranger techniques. You're greeted by a short woman in a saffron tunic and boots made of stitched turnip leather. She's watering a row of plants with something that smells like herbal soup and personal regret. Visitors, she says, not unkindly. Brace yourself. She leads you down a row of labeled plots. Carrots grown with loud singing, stunted but colorful. Rice watered with philosopher tears. Unclear results. Potatoes trained to grow upward, defiant and lumpy. Turnip hemp hybrid genus Confucicae shredded by goats. Twice. You're speechless. She grins. This is where policy meets hope. And a shovel. You ask if anything has actually worked. She nods toward a shady plot in the corner. There, modest and pale, sits a perfect row of turnips. Always the turnip, she says. They're like bureaucracy, slow-grounded and inexplicably still here. She offers you one. It's warm from the sun, a little dirt still clinging to the ridges. You thank her and cradle it in your palm. What happens next, you ask? She shrugs. We try fermenting it in tea, or maybe bribing ducks. There's always a next idea. Back in the city proper, you head toward the fire ledger tower, not because you're required to, but because rumor has it they've kept copies of every emergency ration scroll ever soaked, burned, or accidentally eaten. You reach the base of the tower. It's covered in pigeons and memorial graffiti. Inside, a monk greets you. Sort of. He's in the middle of rebinding a scroll that appears to have survived both mildew and heartbreak. This, he says, holding up the bundle, was found behind a cabinet during renovations. Dated 200 years ago. Labeled simply, for when all else fails. You ask what's inside. He opens it carefully. Instruction. Hide the turnip. Pretend to be a scholar. If caught, recite poetry until boredom wins. You laugh. He doesn't. Saved a city once, he says, or so the story claims. You thank him and leave. The sky is golden now. Clouds slow and thoughtful. You bite into a preserved plum someone left on a windowsill, sweet sharp, possibly cursed. And you realize something. All these scrolls, these ledgers, these ridiculous turnip plans, they weren't about preventing failure. They were about enduring it. With humor. With ink. With roots. You make your way down a narrow alley flanked by sun-warmed walls, the kind of back street where laundry flutters like lazy banners, and every shadow feels like a catnap waiting to happen. The turnip in your satchel shifts slightly as you walk, as if it too is trying to get comfortable in this labyrinth of odd knowledge and bureaucratic survival. You're heading now toward a place few tourists or even locals ever bother with, the Ministry of Oaths. Not the dramatic ceremonial kind of oaths. Not the ones sworn before emperors or beneath battle standards. These are the quiet, practical oaths. The ones sworn before issuing food stamps. Before approving drought subsidies. Before guaranteeing that the 30 baskets of high-quality millet aren't just cleverly disguised pebbles. You find the office nestled behind a perfumery and a suspiciously silent tea stall. The front is unmarked except for a single carved character over the door Shin Trust. You push the door open. Immediately the scent of ink and dried citrus hits you. A board attendant greets you with a raised brow and a stamp in hand. His robe is teal, his sandals are patched, and his forehead bears the permanent crease of someone who once tried to reconcile 3 versions of the same spreadsheet. Swearing in or digging through archives, he asks. Looking into food guarantee oaths, you reply. Specifically, root crops. His eyes narrow, but he nods and gestures toward a door marked Oth Vault. Inside is a room lined with drawers, hundreds of them. Possibly thousands. Each labeled with phrases like seasonal vegetable promises, emergency soup swears, drought year, truths and half-truths, suspect saffron pledges. You pull one open. Inside a small scroll frayed at the edges. It reads, By the moon and the harvest gods, I swear these turnips were not picked early, nor hollowed, nor disguised with wax. May my porridge curdle if I lie. You blink. Another oath written in shakier hand. Upon the head of my uncle and my donkey, I declare these roots to be starchy, sincere, and suitable for both boiling and satire. You glance up at the attendant who shrugs. Some took it seriously, he says. Some just liked dramatic flourishes. One guy swore on his future goat. No idea what that meant. You dig deeper. There's a sealed pouch. You open it carefully. Inside is a thin sheet of bark with elegant brushwork. Should these tubers fail to feed the garrison, let it be known that my heart was pure, my field unfortunate, and my neighbors too generous with their rats. You set it down delicately. Historians still argue the attendant notes whether oaths like these had legal weight or just served as emotional insurance. You thank him and step out into a city that's starting to yawn toward evening. You pass a shrine to the kitchen god. Offerings of rice tea and a small, yes, perfectly peeled turnip rest at its base. You're heading now to a courtyard theater where rumor says they're performing a puppet play based entirely on bureaucratic disaster scrolls. Naturally, you cannot resist. The courtyard is dim, lanterns already lit, and a modest crowd has gathered. The stage is a repurposed vegetable cart turned on its side with two children crouched behind it, manipulating paper puppets. A narrator clears his throat and begins, "In the year of the long winter when carrots wept and leeks deserted their posts, laughter ripples through the crowd. A puppet in the shape of a turnip, complete with drawn-on frown, takes center stage. I am the root of last resort," it declares. "I demand respect and seasoning." Another puppet shaped like a panicked official with inky fingers bows low. "Oh, noble tuber, save us from hunger and committee meetings." You smile broadly. A woman next to you mutters, "First good play all week." The performance continues. A puppet official swears an oath on a bundle of beets, then immediately tries to cook the evidence. The crowd loves it. And yes, it's silly, but it's also history. In its way. After the show, you wander the back alleys near the old tax district. They're wedged between a cobbler's stall and a suspiciously quiet dumpling shack. You find something unexpected, the Hall of Forgotten Seals. Not a grand place, barely more than a storage hut with dreams. But inside, stamps, dozens, hundreds. All once used to approve or deny food rations, to authorize tax waivers, to mark scrolls with the ink of reluctant authority. You're greeted by a custodian who appears to be at least part dust. He motions for silence, then leads you to a shelf labeled Root-Based Authorizations. One stamp reads, "Verified for stew use only." Another, "Inspected and approved by the Committee for Tubular Integrity." You pick up a heavy wooden seal. The handle is worn smooth, the face engraved with 3 characters. Honest soil yield. You ask how often these stamps were actually used. The custodian smiles. "More than we know, less than we hoped." He offers to let you stamp something. You hesitate. Then pull a scrap of parchment from your satchel and press the stamp down. A perfect imprint. You add it to your satchel, unsure why, but knowing you'll keep it. Outside, night fully arrives. The air shifts cooler, quieter, more reflective. You pass by an old man feeding leftover cabbage to pigeons and whispering to them in what sounds like policy guidelines. You smile. Because here in this strange ancient city of scrolls and satire, you finally understand it was never about turnips. It was about belief, in systems, in survival, in the odd poetry of promises made over soup, and maybe, just maybe, in the quiet magic of things rooted deep, but still reaching upward. The night air drapes itself over the city like a linen sheet still warm from the wash. Familiar, heavy, but oddly comforting. You move quietly now, footsteps soft against the smooth stones of the path, leading away from the Hall of Forgotten Seals. The little turnip stamp you made, still damp with ink, flutters slightly in your satchel, a bureaucratic whisper from a world that once treated vegetables like variables in divine equations. Your next stop isn't a shrine or archive or office. It's a kitchen. More specifically, the Imperial Commissary Training Kitchen. A place where the people who fed the people who ruled everyone else learned how not to poison them, or at least how to do it politely. You find it tucked behind a grain warehouse, a low structure shaped like practicality with steam, rising from behind a bamboo fence. There's no sign, just the aroma of broth and a guard half asleep by the door. You nod, he nods. Inside is organized chaos. Trainee cooks young, sweaty, uncertain move like flustered bees around a central hearth. Some are ladling porridge, some are slicing preserved vegetables. One is aggressively scrubbing a wok that looks like it's seen several dynasties and possibly a minor deity. At a side table, an instructor watches arms folded robe, spotless expression carved from unimpressed base salt. You clear your throat. Visitor, he says without turning. Observational, you nod. He gestures to a stool and hands you a thin booklet. The title reads, The Imperial Route Protocol Edition 9, revised after incident with the yams. You flip it open. Inside are diagrams, charts, temperature gradients. A full 2 pages dedicated to visual assessment of honesty in tubers. One passage reads, When evaluating the suitability of turnips for high-ranking digestion, consider shape density peel, uniformity, and emotional neutrality. Another, root vegetables served in ceremonial context must not resemble political figures. This is critical. You blink. The instructor finally turns to you. We lost a prefect once, he says to a radish that looked too much like the Grand Minister. Caused offense. Caused a duel. Caused soup delay. Not acceptable. You stare. Historians still argue whether the resemblance was deliberate, he adds. I say it was just a smug root. He walks you over to a simmering pot labeled Practice Kanji. The cook tending it is trembling slightly, possibly from nerves or the sheer weight of expectations. What's the root of the day, the instructor asks. The cook clears their throat. Turnip master, sliced, rinsed, thrice steamed twice. The instructor nods, then ladles out a spoonful and tastes. He pauses, grimaces, turns to you. Taste, honest, he says. You taste it too. He's not wrong. It's mild, warm, slightly sweet. Earthy in that way that makes you picture misty fields and distant mornings. The kind of flavor that doesn't shout but shows up. That's good, the instructor says. And the trainee exhales like a thunder god just changed his mind. You know the instructor continues handing you a thin strip of boiled turnip we used to keep panic scrolls here. You blink, like emergency recipes. No, panic scrolls, he repeats. For if the emperor died during a banquet. You blink again. There's protocol for everything he explains. What to do if a chicken offends an envoy. What to do if soup curdles mid-tribute. What to do if a turnip cracks in a way that implies political dissent. And if the emperor chokes, he says solemnly, or simply expires. You reach for the scroll, you follow the ritual, you save face, even if you can't save the emperor. He points toward a lacquered box on the far wall. It's small, ornate, locked. That's a replica, he explains. The real scroll's in the palace vault, but the copy holds weight. If something ever went wrong, you open it, read it, you don't improvise. You stare at the box. Imagine the chaos it was designed to quell. The instructor sighs. See, you can't just feed the powerful. You have to soothe them. You have to protect the illusion of control. And sometimes that illusion rests on a turnip that doesn't fall apart under pressure. He hands you a slice of that exact root dried and preserved with ginger and a hint of plum. This one, he says, has passed inspection 7 times. Might make it to the imperial table one day. You chew slowly, it tastes calm. A strange compliment, but true. You thank him and slip back outside. Rome, or its sleepy twin, late night. Bureaucratic Rome is still gently rustling. You follow the scent of sesame oil toward a noodle cart, manned by someone humming an off-key lullaby to a pot of boiling broth. You sit, you eat. You watch the steam swirl upward like lost scrolls trying to find their readers. And you think how strange it is that so many layers of fear protocol, reverence, and ritual can wrap themselves around something as simple as a root. You remember the phrase from the kitchen manual, emotional neutrality. And you laugh. Because no vegetable is truly neutral. Somewhere in that mildness is defiance. Memory, comfort, maybe even prophecy. The cart vendor asks if you want more. You shake your head. The turnip in your satchel doesn't stir. But you swear. It's listening. You slip back into the rhythm of the city like a single drop joining a river. Nothing dramatic, but undeniably part of the flow. The noodle broth still lingers on your tongue, chased faintly by the memory of dried turnip. And that phrase from the manual, emotional neutrality. You smile because you're starting to suspect that turnips are anything but neutral. They're loaded. With memories. With function. With weirdly high-stakes culinary bureaucracy. Today's path leads you upward physically and metaphorically. The hill you climb is crowned with what remains of one of the many smaller administrative temples, now mostly repurposed for civil disputes and retirement paperwork. The locals call it the archive that won't retire. Even the pigeons seem too exhausted to flap. Inside it smells like old paper and ink, mixed with incense and furniture polish. The walls are lined with shelves, and the shelves are lined with scrolls, and the scrolls are tied with ribbons in varying states of passive aggression. A clerk in saffron robes spots you. "You're late," he says, despite not knowing who you are. "I'm curious," you reply. He sniffs, considers, then waves you toward a reading alcove. "Curiosity gets you exactly 1 hour," he says. "Then we fog the room to kill the mold." "Fair enough." He hands you a scroll that, according to the label, tracks food stipends for junior scribes over a 3-decade period. You unroll it. The ink is faded but legible. The entries vary wildly in tone, some formal, others downright whiny. Stipend reduced again. Surviving on millet porridge and pickled turnips. Send figs or send my resignation. Received extra portion of dried rapa. Cannot tell if gift or punishment. Note to self, if I ever rise in rank, I will ban turnips from all festivals. You laugh quietly. Then pause, because one entry stands out not for its complaints, but for its formatting. It's a poem. A poem about ration cycles. You squint and read aloud under your breath. When rice runs dry and fish grow rare, let root rise up with soil to spare. It knows no pride, nor asks for praise, it simply waits in muddy haze. You glance up. The clerk is watching you. Didn't expect verse in the ledgers, you say. He shrugs. That one authored by a scribe who later became a minor chancellor. Said the turnip taught him everything he knew about patience. He joins you at the table, brushing aside a rolled census log, like it's yesterday's gossip. Historians still argue whether those poetic entries were part of a secret code, he says. Some think they were signals during political purges. Others say they were just bored clerks trying to stay sane. You nod. Both options feel likely. He pulls a narrow scroll from his sleeve. This one, he says, is a copy of a copy. Supposedly from a now-lost manual on turnip symbolism. The header reads, "On the interpretation of roots in imperial dreams." You blink. Is this real? He sighs. Depends on your definition of real. You skim it. According to the scroll, a cracked turnip foretells civil unrest. A bloated turnip portends bureaucratic bloat. A sweet-smelling turnip signals a stable harvest. A turnip that floats in vinegar without spinning indicates the presence of a loyal advisor. You close your eyes. That last one definitely came from someone who'd been awake too long and near too many brine jars. Still, part of you wants it to be true. The clerk leans back and stares at the ceiling beams, which are etched with tiny prayer marks offerings from generations of ink-stained dreamers. Do you know he says that there's a policy draft somewhere that would have made turnip cultivation a requirement for all civil servants? You raise an eyebrow. Mandatory farming, you ask. He nods. 2 weeks a year, he says. Hands in the soil, roots in the dirt. To remind the bureaucrats that paperwork doesn't grow food. Did it pass, you ask? He laughs bitterly. Of course not. Too many senators allergic to mud. But you imagine it anyway. A whole row of officials in silk-trimmed robes fumbling with hose, squinting at weeds, panicking over worms. A seasonal regrounding exercise. Humbling. Literal. Historians still argue whether the draft was satire, the clerk adds. Personally, I think it was revenge. He gently re-rolls the scroll and slips it back into its resting place. Turnips keep showing up, he says, in logs, in metaphors, in punishment stews and congratulatory cakes. They're in the margins of law, but somehow always present. You thank him and step outside. The sun's moved slightly, casting longer shadows from the scroll-shaped eaves of the building. In the street below, a market seller is holding up a turnip, carved into the likeness of a grumpy official shouting, "Buy wisdom. Buy wisdom." A child points and laughs. The carving does look wise, or at least extremely annoyed. You descend the steps, slowly fingering the scroll scrap you tucked into your pocket. The dream interpretation bit. You're not entirely sure what it means. But you know this much: it meant something to someone. And in a city where dreams, laws, and vegetables cross paths more often than anyone wants to admit, that's probably enough. You find a shaded stone bench and sit for a moment. The turnip in your bag is quiet. The wind lifts a loose page of parchment across the street. And you wonder, not for the first time, if one day someone will find a scrap of your day. Your words. Your snack list. And decide it meant something too. The breeze is warm, now dry, papery, like the skin of an old scroll, and it rustles the hem of your tunic as you make your way down the slope toward the edge of the old market quarter. The streets here are worn smooth by centuries of sandals, carts, and frustrated pacing. A stray chicken blinks at you as if wondering whether you're edible. You nod at it in solidarity. We all question our purpose sometimes. You've been told there's a place here, half tavern, half archive, where retired civil servants gather to swap stories. grumble about tax reform, and occasionally recite bureaucratic limericks after too much plum wine. It's called the ink pot. And yes, there's a sign hanging over the doorway, a clay amphora with a quill stuck in it, and a little painted turnip at the base. Inside it's dim and cozy. Wooden beams overhead, low tables, shelves stuffed with mismatched scrolls and bound notebooks that no one has cataloged in years. The air smells of ink-pickled radish and nostalgia. You take a seat near the back, close to a sunbeam, filtering in through a broken shutter. A serving girl appears, says nothing, and brings you a bowl of something steaming. You assume it's edible. Possibly soup. Definitely includes turnip. At the next table, a group of elderly men in faded robes are arguing gently over the correct phrasing of an ancient property code. I'm telling you, one says, tapping the table with a chopstick. The clause clearly says, the land is measured by the harvestable yield, not the fence line. Only if it's not floodplain, says another. Otherwise, you have to include margin allowances. Remember the Lotus Decree of 471. A third leans in. Historians still argue whether the Lotus Decree was ever actually enforced. They all nod sagely, then immediately begin bickering again. You try the soup. It's decent, rooty. Spicy in the way pepper is spicy when it's been stored next to something bolder. But there's comfort in it, and a surprising hint of citrus. An old woman with a tattoo of a scroll on her forearm plops down across from you. She's got a bowl, too, and a small clay cup filled with what smells like regret and rice alcohol. You here for the ledger fragments, she asks. You blink. Excuse me. She nods toward the back corner. They're over there. Drawer labeled, stuff we couldn't burn. Well, you fetch them. Inside the drawer are fragments, some brittle bamboo slips, others scraps of wax tablets, and one piece of fabric that someone has used as a napkin/accounting record. You recognize the handwriting style, late Joe period, probably minor magistrate notes. One entry reads, received 6 bundles of rapa as apology for broken gate. Accepted. Gate still broken. Another, ordered confiscation of turnip-based counterfeit coins. Texture too moist. You glance up. Counterfeit coins. The woman cackles. Yup. Someone once molded coins out of pressed root paste, dusted them with ash, and tried to pass them off during a silver shortage. Lasted about an hour, but we still tell the story. There's a clay jug on her table marked, "Don't open this," so obviously you do. It's empty. You missed your chance, she says. That was turnip wine, fermented for 3 years in an abandoned granary. You make a face. Exactly, she nods. You lean back and watch the room. It's full of tiny moments, a scribe dipping his finger into ink and tasting it absent-mindedly. 2 junior clerks at the bar practicing how to bow correctly to an invisible auditor. A retired record keeper carving a turnip into a small smug owl. You ask the old woman why everyone here seems to be carving roots. She shrugs. Same reason birds sing. It keeps the madness out. Then she leans forward. Want to hear something strange? Always. Back in the day, there was a superstition unwritten but widely followed. If you were about to file a major tax review or submit a corruption report, you had to eat something grown underground first. Why? Symbolism, she says. Roots anchor, roots reveal. They said a bite of turnip made your conscience steadier. She picks up a slice from her bowl and chews thoughtfully. Historians still argue whether it was just a clever excuse to make bland food sacred, but it stuck. You try it, one more bite, and honestly, you get it. There's something earthy, dependable, even bracing about it. Later, a man with ink stains on his sleeves hands you a folded scrap of parchment. No name, no explanation, just one phrase. Truth tastes better with vinegar. You thank him. He shrugs. Came from an old tax code. Appendix F, line 17. We think. By the time you step outside again, the sun has mellowed, sliding into its golden phase. The alley smells of baking bread and dried leaves. A boy runs past chasing a hoop. A dog runs past chasing the boy. The city hums. You look down at your satchel, feel the weight of the carved turnip charm inside. You take it out. Hold it up to the sun. Watch the light bleed through its thinnest edge. It's not magic, it's not history, but it's yours now. You're threading this great, silly, serious tapestry, and you think maybe that's enough. You step off the street and into the shade of a colonnade near the Temple of Agriculture. The stone is cool under your feet. It feels like a pause, like Rome herself has briefly leaned back, wiped her brow, and taken a sip of water. Around you, everything slows. The chatter of vendors fades. Even the pigeons seem to be pacing themselves now. You settle onto a bench, not a fancy one, just old stone, slightly uneven with the faint outline of a leaf, pressed forever into the edge, probably from when someone sat here a few hundred years ago and left their garland behind. The turnip charm in your satchel shifts against your hip, reminding you that it's still there, still quietly judging your every decision. Probably. To pass the time, you take out the scroll fragment you snagged from the Inkpot archive. It's rough cracked at the corners, but still legible. Some clerk with very tidy handwriting has documented a shipment of root vegetables by weight, by district, and by perceived spiritual risk. You squint. Yes, there's a column titled Ritual Contamination Potential. One turnip, it seems, had been declared suspect due to a snake sighting in the field. Another had been blessed by a wandering monk and thus marked auspicious. A third simply says too round. Caused panic. You're not making this up. You wonder for a moment how many panicked decisions throughout history came down to produce that looked slightly off. Across the plaza, an old man in a mustard yellow robe is preaching to a group of pigeons. Loudly. Passionately. And if the Ministry of Fertilizer can't tell a turnip from a cursed yam, then we've truly lost our way. The pigeons blink at him. One coos, another poops. He turns to you. Do you believe in edible omens, friend? You nod. Because honestly, what else can you do? Then you understand he says eyes alight. The root does not lie. The root remembers. With that, he marches off robe, flapping behind him like a very tired banner. You're beginning to understand that in Rome it's less about belief and more about consensus. If enough people think a turnip has magic powers, then guess what? It kinda does. It's around this time you remember an old tale, something half whispered at the Inkpot earlier, about the scroll of last resort. You had laughed, because the name sounds dramatic enough to be a gladiator's final move. But apparently it was a real thing, a document used only when all bureaucratic reasoning had failed. Every ancient department had one. A sealed scroll that could only be opened when a crisis reached absolute absurdity. And wouldn't you know it, most versions were stored with you, guessed at a turnip. Why? Well, depending on who you ask. Because the root represented humility before action. Because it absorbed the bad energy of chaotic arguments. Or because it was the only food that wouldn't get stolen if you left it unattended for 3 days. Historians still argue whether these scrolls were ceremonial or actively used. Some think they were just a way for scribes to blow off steam. Others swear a few were opened during key reforms, and that the scrolls inside contained messages like "Stop. You're embarrassing the dynasty." You stand and stretch. The breeze picks up slightly, bringing with it the smell of roasted sesame and something that might be fish. You follow your nose as any rational person would and end up near a row of food stalls. One of them has a sign painted in clumsy characters, "Scroll soup, prepared with honor and root." You order a bowl, because how could you not? The vendor, a woman with arms like tree trunks and an eyebrow scar that tells a story all its own, serves you a steaming mix of broth, radish greens, noodles, and sliced turnip so thin it's practically translucent. There's a small bamboo skewer stabbed into the side of the bowl bearing a scrap of parchment. You pull it out. The writing is crooked but clear. All decisions are harder when you're hungry. You smile. Wisdom scroll, the vendor says. We serve one with every bowl. Costs extra if you want sarcasm. You eat slowly. The soup is salty and soothing. The turnip slices have soaked up the flavor of the broth, but they still carry that telltale earthy whisper that says, "I came from below. Respect me." As you finish, a scholar in sky blue robe sits beside you and orders the same. She glances at your empty bowl, then at your face. "Long day?" she asks. "Long week, you say." She nods. "Root therapy." You raise an eyebrow. "Common among archivists," she explains. When the texts get too contradictory, you eat something simple, something reliable, ground grown. It resets you. You think about it, about everything you've seen and heard and read, about the screaming scrolls, the market debates, the carved charms, the counterfeit coin, the poetry. And you nod. Yes, root therapy. You thank the vendor bow to the scholar and wander off again, this time toward the hills. There's a garden there. Public. Maintained by retirees and grumpy teens doing public service hours, it's not grand, but it's green. And peaceful. You sit on a bench under a fig tree and close your eyes. The city murmurs in the background, less a roar now, more a lullaby. Somewhere nearby, a child is reciting something in a sing-song voice. And when the emperor sneezed, the tax code was revised. And when the goose flew east, they blamed the radishes. And when the turnip glowed, everyone agreed to panic. You smile, because that sounds about right. When you open your eyes again, it's late afternoon and the fig tree has shifted its shade like a protective cloak across your legs. The bench beneath you is warm now, sun-soaked and oddly comforting, like the memory of a well-worn seat at your favorite noodle stall back home. You stretch your arms, blink against the golden slant of sunlight, and remember where you were headed: the Bureau of Civic Rituals. Or as Gaius called it once, the Department of Official Overthinking. This is where the panic scrolls were stored. If anywhere in the city would still have records of those legendary bureaucratic last resorts, it's here. Not in the Senate, not in the Temple archives, and definitely not in a poet's head. The Bureau kept the real stuff. The dusty, suspiciously unlabeled boxes that only got opened when Rome teetered one hysterical inch from collapse. You make your way uphill past a courtyard where two officials in identical robes are arguing about what color counts as ceremonial beige. Their voices are hushed, but their hand gestures scream decades of passive-aggressive memoranda. Eventually you arrive. The Bureau is an unremarkable building, squat symmetrical, built with the kind of serious stonework that says, "We take paperwork very seriously, thank you." The front door is flanked by two statues of scribes mid-quill, their expressions frozen in eternal judgment. You step inside. The air is thick with incense, ink, and ambition. A clerk behind the front desk looks up startled. "You suspect no one comes here unless they have to." "Purpose," he croaks. "Curiosity," you reply. He blinks, then shrugs. "That's section 7. You follow the hall. Each corridor is labeled not with helpful signage, but with phrases like, 'Here lies procedural integrity,' and 'Let none escape unpunished by paragraph.'" Classic. Eventually you arrive in a small chamber filled with scroll racks. Some shelves sag under the weight of clay tablets. Others are strangely bare, as if the knowledge once stored there escaped during a particularly heated staff meeting. At the far end, behind a cordoned-off desk covered in broken wax seals and slightly melted candles, you find it. A locked cabinet. On the door is a plaque. Not engraved, but handwritten in bold black ink, slightly smeared emergency scrolls. Open only if completely doomed. You hesitate, then glance around. No one's watching. You unhook the latch. The cabinet creaks open to reveal a modest wooden box, aged and scuffed. You lift the lid carefully, half expecting trumpets or curses. Instead, there's only silence and a handful of scrolls wrapped in faded ribbon, each with a wax seal bearing the mark of a different magistrate. You pick one at random. The seal is broken already, probably by some nervous clerk during the last locust panic. The scroll reads, "When nothing makes sense and too many voices shout, the root must decide. Present the sacred tuber. All parties shall bite. The bitter shall yield." You blink. Yes, that tracks. You check another. In case of unresolved public debate, slice a turnip crosswise. The side with the more pleasing pattern wins. Record this decision in duplicate. You chuckle. Not because it's funny, but because you can absolutely picture this happening. One final scroll, heavier than the others, contains a full protocol how to conduct a civic emergency turnip consultation. It involves candles, 7 witnesses, and a ceremonial pot of barley tea that must be served at exactly lukewarm but confident temperature. Historians still argue whether any of these rituals were ever carried out in full, or whether they were created as satire, bureaucratic stress relief, or a warning to future civil servants. You return the scrolls to their cabinet and quietly relatch the door. You step outside into the waning afternoon, blinking against the brightness. Rome once again feels too large and too alive for a single explanation. And yet, it works. From the chaos of the markets to the slow deliberation of the scribes from the vendor hawking. Miracle cures to the child quoting turnip-based poetry, this strange, creaky city has built itself around the absurd and the necessary in equal measure. You wander again, this time back down the hill toward the old aqueducts. The sun casts long shadows now, stretching the arches into jagged silhouettes. You pass a man fishing in a fountain with nothing but a ladle and blind hope. You nod to him, he nods back. At a shaded fountain, you stop for water. It's cold, mineral-rich, and probably blessed by 5 minor deities you've never heard of. You sip slowly. A group of students walks by arguing loudly about which vegetable best symbolizes the empire's decline. One insists it's the onion layers of corruption. Another claims it must be garlic strong at first, but lingering with regret. The third says nothing and simply holds up a turnip. They all pause, then nod. You walk on deeper into a small plaza where elders gather at sunset. One of them has a flute and plays slow, reedy notes that coil like incense into the sky. An old woman offers you a seat. You take it. In her lap is a bundle of embroidery, tiny scenes stitched in russet saffron and indigo threads. Among the figures of dancers and donkeys, you spot a vegetable motif. Turnips, of course. Family crest, she says. My grandfather was a turnip farmer. Grew them for temples and tax collectors. You nod, respect. He always said, she adds, when the gods are hungry, they ask for barley. When they're angry, they ask for lamb. But when they just want to remind you who's in charge, they ask for turnips. You watch the last light slip behind the rooftops and everything softens. Rome glows gold for a few brief moments, quiet, forgiving, eternal. You reach into your satchel and find your own turnip still nestled there. Not magical, not glamorous, but it made it through everything, just like the city. Night folds over Rome like a thick velvet cloak, soft but heavy. The stars peek out again, shy but persistent, and the city exhales into its quieter self. Fewer carts, fewer calls. Just footsteps, firelight, and the murmur of the Tiber somewhere in the dark. You find yourself wandering again, this time, drawn not by a destination, but by the comfort of motion. You pass the same bakery from yesterday, now shuttered and warm-smelling. A stray cat stretches across the windowsill, claiming it like inheritance. As you turn down a quieter street, a flicker of torchlight catches your eye. Ahead is a courtyard you don't remember passing before. In its center stands a statue, not of an emperor or a god, but of a woman kneeling with a basket of roots. The base reads, "For what feeds us when the feasts forget?" You step closer. The basket is carved in such detail you can almost feel the rough skin of the vegetables. There's a carrot, a radish, and yes, a large central turnip. The sculptor even caught its gnarled top and uneven ridges. You sit on the low wall beside the statue, letting the quiet settle around you. A door creaks open nearby. An old man steps out carrying a clay bowl. He doesn't seem surprised to see you. "You can see her too?" he asks. You blink, the statue. He chuckles. "No, the root." You glance again. Most people walk by and think it's just a basket of food, he says, setting the bowl down beside you. But those who've eaten, lean those who've cooked with salt and prayer, they know. You peer into his bowl. It's a stew dark thick with steam, rising in lazy curls. You spot a chunk of turnip bobbing at the top. He sees your gaze. "Made it the same way my mother did." Water, scraps, and hope. You take the offered spoon. It tastes like memory, like every pot ever left to simmer while someone worried quietly in the next room. Earthy, a little bitter, somehow warm. The man eats beside you in silence. Eventually he speaks again. "Did you know there was once a Roman play banned for being too sympathetic to vegetables?" You raise an eyebrow. "It's true," he says. The magistrate said it encouraged inappropriate empathy toward non-citizen foodstuffs. You both laugh. Historians still argue, he adds, whether the play even existed. But someone wrote it down, so now it's real. That thought lingers with you as he stands, brushes off his robe, and vanishes into the house again. You linger a little longer in the torchlight before standing to leave. As you walk, you think of how many things survive in footnotes and margin, scribbles and offhand remarks that weren't supposed to matter. Rome is full of those. Ghosts of half-remembered rituals, names of bread bakers carved into stones, notes from a scribe muttering about the stench of tubers. You reach the banks of the Tiber again. It reflects the torchlight like someone spilled molten copper across the water. Along the river wall, you notice a strange line of symbols carved into the stone. They're worn weathered by centuries of rain and pigeons and fingers. You trace them with your hand. It's a crude calendar, but not one that tracks solstices or Senate meetings. It's a crop cycle, marked with little icons, wheat, barley, beans, and near the end of the loop, the familiar bulb of a turnip. Each symbol is paired with a tiny etched face, sometimes smiling, sometimes frowning, once even sneezing. You smile. Someone once stood where you are and cared enough to make this. To leave a reminder, a whisper, a joke for future walkers in the night. You follow the line until it disappears beneath moss and ivy lost to time or boredom. Eventually, you sit at the edge of a dry dock and dangle your feet. The water laps at the stone like a cat testing a nap spot. A group of night fishermen drift past in a shallow boat. They don't speak, but one of them has a lantern, and for a brief moment, it illuminates a small root vegetable tied to the bow. You wonder protection humor. A gift to the river. Who knows? Maybe it's all of them. You lean back and let the stars come into focus again. That one over there still looks like a turnip if you squint. You close your eyes, and in the lull of distant oars and the creak of the river's breath, you feel the oddest peace. Not because anything profound has happened. Not because you've solved the riddles of history or uncovered a buried conspiracy about Rome's vegetable policies, but because you've seen the seams, the ordinary stitches that held this place together. People, meals, arguments, jokes about tubers. You've wandered across scrolls and shrines, markets and mud, and through it all, one truth remains as stubborn as the root itself. The little things endure. They may not be celebrated. They may not get marble monuments or golden wreaths, but they keep the pot full, the stories weird, and the world turning. You stand again. Your feet feel steady. Your satchel is heavier than before, though you haven't added anything new. Except maybe understanding. You head back toward Gaius's villa. The night is warm. The cobblestones are slick with memory. And somewhere behind you, that turnip in the riverboat bobs gently in time with the stars. Back at Gaius's villa, the gate creaks like an old man stretching his back after too long in the garden. The fig tree rustles lazily, its leaves catching a hint of night breeze. You step through the courtyard, bones a little heavier, but thoughts oddly light. You find Gaius still awake, of course. He's in the atrium this time, barefoot and wearing a tunic that looks like it once had structure. A lamp flickers beside him, throwing golden halos onto the water basin and the worn mosaic floor. In his lap, a scroll. In his hand, a spoon. He looks up. You miss dessert. You peer into the bowl. Let me guess. He grins. Turnip pudding, sweetened with date paste and resignation. You sit beside him, pulling your own legs under you like a cat claiming floor space. How was it? Honest, he says. A little damp, like most truths. You smile. He nods toward the scroll. Letters from an old friend, civil servant. Used to manage grain allotments in Sicilia. Dull as uncooked millet, but he once sent me a love poem written entirely in agricultural metaphors. You raise an eyebrow. He reads aloud your beauty stuns like barley blight. And in your arms I'd thresh all night. You both groan. Historians still argue, he mutters, whether bad poetry is a state-sponsored tool for population control. You lean back against a column, letting the warmth of the oil lamp soak into your skin. There's something ancient about this moment. Not in the grandeur of empire sense, but in the quietly human sense. The part where two people sit at the end of a day full of cheap food and cheaper jokes and share the rhythm of breathing. I visited the tabularium you offer. Gaius whistles. Risky. You make eye contact with the clerk, and next thing you know, you're calculating cabbage tariffs for a decade. They had records, you say, turnip requisitions to legionnaires' tax complaints, panic notes from scribes. He chuckles. Panic scrolls. Literal panic scrolls, you nod. Someone wrote, too many tubers, not enough patience. Gaius closes his eyes and exhales like a man remembering a favorite embarrassment. They never taught that in rhetoric class. You glance over at the shelf beside him. Among the usual amphorae and scroll boxes sits something new, a tiny wooden carving. It looks like a turnip, but it has legs. You stare. Oh, Gaius says without looking. That's Rapa Volocris, the flying turnip. You're not sure if he's joking. It was a children's story, he continues. Supposedly written to discourage over-harvesting. The idea was that if you picked too many, the last one would sprout wings and chase you. You laugh. Sounds terrifying. It was, he nods solemnly, especially the illustrated version. Big eyes, very judgmental. You reach out and pick it up. It's surprisingly heavy. Someone carved this with care, shaped the wings with little feather details, gave it a face that somehow manages both disapproval and eternal patience. Did you ever believe in it, you ask? He shrugs. Belief is a luxury, roots are practical. But sometimes on late nights after bad harvests, you start to wonder. The courtyard quiets. The water in the basin reflects the lamplight in soft ripples. Somewhere, a cicada strikes up a solo performance. The night breathes around you. You set the turnip back on the shelf. I think Rome survives because of things like that you say. Not the buildings or the generals or the gods, but the weird stories people tell when they're tired and hungry. Gaius opens one eye. You sound like a historian. I sound like someone who's eaten a lot of tubers. Same thing. He stands, stretches, groans. His back cracks like a bundle of dry twigs. Come on, he says. Let me show you something. You follow him through a side door and into a room you hadn't noticed before. It's cooler in here, and the air smells faintly of beeswax and old parchment. Shelves line the walls not with scrolls, but with objects, bits and pieces. A chipped ladle, a broken sandal, a child's doll made from straw, a cracked bowl with a painted rim. This, Gaius says, is my private museum. You walk slowly past the shelves. Everything is unremarkable at first glance. But as your eyes adjust, you realize each object holds a whisper. A story, maybe two. Nothing here's worth anything he says, except that someone once thought it was. You stop at a section near the back. There's a row of preserved roots. Some pickled, some dried, one apparently smoked. They sit in labeled jars with names like Flood Year, Plague Year, and That One Bad Decision. I collect them, he says sheepishly. One from every season, one from every turning. You look closer. Each root is unique. One is lopsided, another forked like a snake tongue. One has a perfect spiral etched in by nature or fate. They remind me Gaius says that survival isn't pretty, but it's memorable. He taps the jar labeled Plague Year. This one fed 3 families, tasted like mud and copper. But they lived. You're quiet for a long moment. Then do you label the good years? Gaius smiles. No such thing as a purely good year, but this one he lifts a small jar with a turnip barely larger than a walnut. This one tasted like hope. And time. And the first rain after too much sun. He sets it back. You nod. Come on, he says again. One more thing before we sleep. You follow him outside. The stars are sharp now, the moon thin and smug. He leads you to the outer wall of the villa. There carved into the plaster are dozens of marks. Tiny etchings, some letters, some shapes. My grandmother started it, he says. Every time something mattered, she scratched it in. A harvest, a birth, a really good stew. You run your fingers along the grooves. Some are deep, some shallow. One looks like a turnip. I've added a few, he says. You pull a small stylus from your belt pouch. Gaius raises an eyebrow. You carve a new mark beside the turnip. Just a small swirl. Nothing fancy, but now it's there. You're part of the wall. Your scratch in the history of soup and laughter and stubborn survival. You both step back. Not bad, Gaius says. It'll do. And the night wraps itself back around you, quiet, a little silly, absolutely real. The morning comes slow and syrupy bleeding gold into the corners of the sky. The city's still rubbing its eyes when you wake, but already Rome is preparing itself for another day of noise negotiation, and if you're lucky, a few more root-related surprises. You wash your face at the courtyard basin, its surface still cool from the night, and dress quietly. Gaius is nowhere in sight. There's a half-eaten fig and an empty cup of wine where he probably fell asleep mid-thought. You smile. Today you decide to walk the long way. No plan. Just sandals, sun, and the turnip-shaped shadow trailing you like a companion with nothing better to do. You head northeast past the city's shifting hum and find yourself in one of the older districts, the kind where buildings lean together like conspirators, and the streets feel like a poorly rehearsed maze. You pass a shrine to Mercury where someone has left a fish skeleton, an apology, and a bundle of fresh herbs. Roman multitasking, you suppose. Your destination, if you can call it that, is the workshop of a man named Aelius. You heard about him from a bread seller who told you between crumbs that he makes scrolls scream, which sounds either incredibly illegal or deeply poetic. Turns out it's both. Aelius is a document restorer, or as he describes it, a listener to old paper. He works from a crumbling 2-story house that looks like it gave up on right angles centuries ago. You knock. The door opens before your knuckles land. You're late, he says, though. You never arranged a time. He's thin ink-stained and smells like vinegar and regret. Inside, the air is thick with rolled parchments, drying glue, and the distinct scent of mold that refuses to admit it's been evicted. Scrolls are stacked like firewood. There's a pigeon perched on a windowsill watching you with the disapproval of a civil servant. Aelius hands you a stool. Sit, he says. And don't breathe too enthusiastically. These things are older than your gods. You obey. He unrolls a battered document onto the table and weights the corners with bits of pottery. The text is faded smudged but not lost. Tax decree, he mutters. Year of the bitter olives. You lean in. It's about tithes collected in the countryside north of Aricia. Among the usual quotas, grain wine wool there, it is Rapa the humble turnip. 5 crates per household, or one enormous one if properly blessed. Historians still argue Aelius says with a grin, whether that clause was real law or a scribe's joke. You stare. Blessed by whom? He shrugs. Doesn't say. Could be the local god. Could be someone's grandma with particularly firm religious convictions. You both laugh. Then Aelius grows quiet. He gestures toward a stack of more fragile scrolls. You want the real treasures, he says. They're in the margins. Doodles, notes, panic corrections. He holds one up. Someone has scrawled a drawing in the corner, a turnip being chased by what looks like a bureaucrat holding a ledger. Another scroll features a scribbled recipe. For stomach ails, boil 1 root with rosemary and vinegar applied to feet. You blink. To the feet? Apparently yes. Did it work? Considering it was written next to a request for burial funds, I'm guessing no. Still, you keep reading. Because these notes, these little asides, they're what make history feel real. Not the proclamations or the census figures, but the mess in the margins. Aelius offers you tea. It tastes like old parchment and a hint of mint. You drink it anyway. I once found a love letter on the back of a tax form, he says, smiling faintly. It started, My dearest Sprout. You try not to choke on the tea. They were farmers, he explains. Apparently their affection grew alongside the winter vegetables. You wipe your mouth. Did they end up together? He shrugs. Paper doesn't tell me that, but they shared a harvest. That's something. Eventually you rise. The day's heat has begun to settle in. Aelius walks you to the door. He hands you a scrap of vellum. On it a sketch of a turnip arms akimbo standing proudly atop a pile of coins. For luck, he says. You nod, tuck it in your satchel, and step back into the world. Outside, Rome has hit its midday lull. The streets are slower smells, sharper baking bread, sweat a hint of summer wine leaking from a broken amphora. You cut through a narrow alley and emerge near the Temple of Concord. There a small crowd has gathered not for a sermon or a trial, but for a performance. A man in a tattered saffron cloak stands atop a broken column reciting what sounds suspiciously like an ode to root vegetables. You linger at the edge. He holds up a gnarled turnip. This, he bellows, fed rebels and philosophers alike. A few people clap. One vendor mutters something about onions being underappreciated. He continues. It neither flatters nor deceives. It is not graceful, but it is honest. And it will outlast all your marble. I say, you clap too. Because why not? After all, he's not wrong. And as you walk away, his final line follows you like the echo of something older than stone. History remembers the kings, but hunger remembers the roots. You carry that with you as you return to Gaius's garden satchel, a little fuller scroll smell, still clinging to your sleeves and your thoughts simmering like stew just shy of a boil. Your home, if you can call this slightly overgrown Roman garden and its wine-scented philosopher home. Gaius is asleep again this time under the fig tree, one sandal off his scrolls acting as a makeshift pillow. A bee lazily circles his cup. You don't wake him. Instead, you settle back onto the familiar stone bench and pull out your satchel. Out comes the sketch Aelius gave you, your little triumphant turnip, posing atop a pile of coins. You smooth the corner and smile. It's absurd. But like everything else in this city, it's starting to make a strange kind of sense. Today's journey had promised economics, and you certainly got a crash course in that. But what lingers isn't the numbers. It's the little voices tucked into the scroll margins, the whispered jokes of long-dead clerks, and the passion of men who still perform odes to root vegetables in public. Rome is vast, chaotic, glorious in a way that's more stubborn than grand, and somehow through all the statues and senators and sandal-soled pride, the turnip has nestled itself into the folds of daily life like a quiet punchline. Gaius stirs beside you and mutters something about bees and betrayal. You chuckle softly. Later that afternoon, you both venture out again, this time to a quiet, ivy-choked villa near the Calian Hill. You've been invited to a tasting. That's the word used. You're not entirely sure what to expect. The hostess, a wealthy widow named Servia, greets you in a robe dyed saffron and adorned with embroidered clusters of grapevines. She smells faintly of honey and ambition. Her courtyard is shady and fragrant, with terracotta lamps lit too early just to make a statement. On the table, a series of small clay bowls, each labeled in careful script. Turnip relish, pickled root paste, rapa mousse with date reduction, and disturbingly fermented surprise. You glance at Gaius. He nods the way men nod before plunging into a river with questionable currents. The first bite is okay, the second tangy, the third alarming. By the fourth, your taste buds have gone on strike and are filing formal grievances. But Servia beams. It's about elevating the peasant, she explains, pouring wine that tastes of pepper and old philosophy. Taking the humble and making it divine. Gaius chews slowly. Does the humble want to be divine? She laughs, so that's not the point. Historians still argue, he murmurs to you later, mouth full of mousse, whether Roman elite cuisine was more about taste or theater. You lean toward theater. As the feast continues, the conversation drifts agriculture symbolism. A debate about whether Mercury would be more inclined to bless turnip fields or fig orchards. The guests are pleasant, well-read, and mostly tipsy. You meet a merchant who once traded a cart of rare spices for a dozen crates of salt-preserved rapa because the general in charge was a fan. Another guest claims his grandmother used to polish her brass with boiled turnip water. You had to let it cool first, he warns solemnly, or the fumes would ruin your eyesight. You nod, tucking that into your growing collection of root-based folk wisdom. By the time the dessert arrives, turnip custard with honey drizzle, your palate has surrendered. Your stomach is unsure whether to thank you or stage a revolt, and Gaius is quoting Virgil at a bowl of olives. You make your excuses. On the walk back through the narrow streets, Gaius says, "You know what I miss?" You arch an eyebrow. Simple turnips. Boiled? Bit of salt? No sauces, no mousse. Just food that tastes like soil and staying alive. You grin. We could ask Servia for the recipe. He shudders. Don't you dare. The sun hangs low now, casting copper shadows over the city's edges. You pass a group of children drawing on a wall with burnt cork. They're sketching vegetables. One turnip has a crown, another has wings. You pause to admire. They're making heroes, one child explains. The turnip army. They're going to fight the spinach. You nod gravely. Spinach never stood a chance. Later that night, back at the villa, Gaius finds a dusty amphora at the bottom of a shelf. Turnip wine, he declares. Experimental, possibly cursed. You each sip. It's horrific. You both laugh so hard the fig tree shakes. Afterward, he tells you a story half true, half fermented nonsense about a soldier who snuck a turnip into a Senate session, carved a face into it, and claimed it was the reincarnation of an old tribune. No one disagreed Gaius finishes because it had more to say than half the Senate. You lean back, staring at the stars above. They're quiet tonight. Steady. The kind of quiet that lets small thoughts feel important. You pull the real turnip from your bag. It's softening, dimpling at the top. But still here, still real. And suddenly you wonder how many lives this little root has touched. How many hands planted it, pickled it, tossed it into a stew pot, or carved it into a warning or a joke. History often feels like stone, like empires and decrees. But tonight it feels like something else. Something earthy, resilient. Something boiled, salted, and passed around a smoky table after a long day. It rains the next morning. Not the dramatic lightning-splitting kind of storm favored by epic poets, but the soft, lingering drizzle that Rome sometimes allows in between its grander performances. The rooftops glisten. The cobblestones become little rivers, and the city smells not of smoke and ambition, but of wet dust, olive leaves, and cooling bread. You sit under the overhang of Gaius's portico, wrapped in a slightly damp wool shawl, holding a warm cup of barley broth. The turnip rests beside you on the ledge, now patched with one brown bruise, but still managing to look faintly judgmental. Gaius emerges with a scowl and an oilcloth, muttering about how nothing ruins philosophical clarity like soggy tunics. Rain, he sighs, is the Republic's way of telling you to reconsider your opinions. You nod solemnly, then ask, do turnips grow well in rain? He considers. They don't mind it, not like grapes. Grapes are drama queens, but roots. Roots dig in and wait. And then it seems is the mood of the day, digging in and waiting. By mid-morning, the rain lightens enough for an errand. Gaius suggests a visit to the Temple of Ceres, the goddess of agriculture grains and conveniently overlooked tubers. The walk is slow. Puddles splash, cloaks drip. Rome seems smaller in the rain, quieter. The shouting is muted. Even the dogs seem subdued. The temple is simple, all things considered. modest columns, a roof patched with moss, but inside it's dry and golden lit with rows of candles and perfumed with crushed laurel and incense. Offerings line the altar baskets of grain sprigs of fennel, a few carefully arranged figs, and one lone turnip. You blink, step closer. It's fresh, plump, resting in a small bronze bowl flanked by 2 sprigs of thyme. Someone left a note beneath it written in rough script, wax-stained for the strength to wait out the drought. You feel a lump in your throat, because this isn't a joke, not a satire, not a culinary experiment. It's a prayer plain and rooted, a hope wrapped in skin and soil. Gaius notices your stare. Historians still argue whether such offerings were symbolic or sincere. You shrug. Why not both? On the way back, you pass a merchant sheltering under a cloth awning. He's carving something into a block of wood, slow, methodical cuts. You stop to watch. It's a scene of a banquet. Guests reclining on couches, a servant holding a platter, and on that platter, a single proud turnip. You point. He shrugs. Someone ordered it for a housewarming gift. Said it was historically ironic. You ask how often he gets that kind of commission. Often enough, he says. Vegetables are the new marble. You chuckle. Then notice a stack of unfinished carvings beside him, one of a Roman senator with a turnip for a head. You ask, he grins. Satire sells. Back at the villa, the rain has stopped. The fig leaves drip rhythmically onto the stone basin. The sky is pale and milky like watered wine. You and Gaius decide to make something warm. Something honest. A pot of stew goes on lentils, onion, a bit of dried sausage, and of course, chopped turnip. You peel it carefully. The skin gives way, the flesh beneath pale and dense. You drop it into the pot and stir. As the steam rises, the scent wraps around you both like a memory. Of hungry winters, of crowded kitchens, of quiet moments with no grand conclusions. Gaius says nothing for a while. Then, you know what bothers me. You glance over. All the things we forget. All the small miracles that never get written down. The meals that fed people but weren't worth recording. The farmers who grew roots and didn't name them after gods. The children who survived because someone had the sense to pickle a turnip. You stir the pot slowly. Let the silence hang. Then, but we remember now. He smiles. Yes, now we do. That night, after dinner, after the wine and the storytelling, and the moment when you both tried to invent a turnip-based calendar, Rutember was vetoed, you return to your room. The turnip drawing still sits folded in your satchel. You place it on the windowsill beside the real one. The two stare out over the darkened city like mismatched guardians. And for the first time in a long while, you feel entirely present. Not nostalgic, not anxious. Just here, grounded like a root. You lie down on the narrow bed, the wool blanket rough but warm. Rain taps lightly on the shutter. Somewhere a cat yowls at a pigeon who absolutely started it. And you close your eyes full of soup-soft light and the strange certainty that even the quietest things, humble, lumpy, dirt-specked things, can carry weight, even if no one's watching. Especially then. Morning arrives with the smell of toasted barley and something else slightly sweet, slightly sour, definitely suspicious. You stretch beneath the heavy blanket and stare at the wooden beams overhead. There's a creak from somewhere in the house, followed by Gaius's unmistakable voice calling, "You'd better be awake. Today is the fermentation trial." You groan. Fermenting turnips, as it turns out, is a slow process with vast consequences. You shuffle into the kitchen, rubbing your eyes, and Gaius is already there, wearing an apron that seems to have once belonged to a gladiator, or at least lost a fight with one. On the table sit 2 clay jars, one open, and already emitting the kind of scent that could strip paint. He hands you a spoon. You hesitate. Are we sure this is safe? Historians still argue whether early Roman fermentation was culinary genius or desperate improvisation, he says cheerfully. Either way, it builds character. You sip. The flavor is complex. Earthy vinegary with a hint of wild herb and regret. You blink a few times. It's not bad exactly. It's just unapologetically turnip. See, he says, you're stronger already. You spend the morning documenting the recipe. Because if history forgets this moment, it will not be for lack of notes. By midday, the villa is quiet again, and the sun hangs overhead like a patient overseer. You sit in the courtyard sketching a little cartoon turnip in your wax tablet. You give it a frown and a crown. Gaius peers over your shoulder. Ah, the Prince of Roots. Long may he simmer. After lunch, a stew that tastes better than it has any right to, given that its base is leftovers and sheer optimism, you decide to visit the small bookstall near the Forum. There's a rumor that someone's been writing satirical poems about Roman vegetables. Naturally, you're intrigued. The vendor is a wiry man with ink-stained fingers and the look of someone who either hasn't slept or hasn't stopped thinking in about 10 years. He waves a scroll at you with a dramatic flourish. "Ode to the tubers," he announces, anonymous of course, as all wisdom must be. You unroll it carefully. The first lines read, "O noble root, thou art not sleek, but in thy flesh our souls do seek. Thou boil'st, thou roast'st, thou tasteth odd, yet feed'st the folk more well than God." You laugh aloud. "Want it?" the vendor asks. 3 copper. 2 if you promise to recite it at a dinner party. You pay the full 3. Poetry deserves respect. Scroll in hand, you stroll toward the Baths of Agrippa. Not for a soak, though the idea is tempting, but to see if the rumor is true that someone carved a tiny turnip into the stonework above the changing room. You ask the attendant, who squints at you suspiciously. "You're the 3rd person this week," he mutters. "What is it with you people and that vegetable?" But he lets you in. And yes, it's there. Just above the mosaic frieze of dolphins and garlands. Small, perfectly rounded, nestled between 2 waves. You reach up and trace it lightly with your finger. There's no plaque, no explanation. Just a turnip, quiet, immortalized. Later, back at the villa, you and Gaius sit with the scroll between you, reading verses aloud while eating chunks of roasted bread and olive paste. The sky outside deepens into amber. The lamps are lit. You pause. Do you think it's possible to track a civilization by its vegetables? He chews thoughtfully. Maybe. If you're honest about what you're looking for. What do you mean? Well, he says, wiping his hands, everyone writes down the grand things. Battles, laws, gods. But the real stuff, the things people touch every day, that's harder. That's messier. That's turnips. You nod, and it's true. There's something oddly satisfying in knowing that the same root you just mashed with garlic and thyme once fed a soldier on campaign starred in a comedic play was cursed by a quartermaster, and maybe cured someone's superstition. You glance around the room. The wax scroll, the etched plates, the jars of pickled odds and ends. The little carved turnip on the shelf. This isn't a museum, it's a kitchen, a garden, a study, a life. You lean back and exhale. The wine is soft in your belly, the lamps flicker low. Outside, a breeze rustles the fig tree. You hear a distant whistle, maybe a flute, maybe just the wind pretending. And beside you, the scroll rests open to its final lines. Though kings may rise and empires fall, though marble cracks and statues crawl, the turnip waits through time and trial. A root, a joke, a truth, a smile. You smile, because it's ridiculous. And it's perfect. Afternoon drapes itself across Rome like a well-worn cloak, creased, comforting, and a little sun-bleached. You step outside again, this time with no scrolls, no errands, no clever turnip-based intentions. Just a walk, just air. Just the slow procession of a city that somehow never sits still. The streets are calmer now. Midday chaos has given way to a softer rhythm. Merchants yawning behind stalls, dogs, sunbathing like marble lions, children tracing games into the dirt with bits of broken amphory. You pass by a fountain shaped like a fish, swallowing its own tail. And as you tilt your head back to drink, you catch a glimmer of something tucked behind the pedestal. A coin. No, on closer inspection, it's not a coin. It's a token. Clay cracked slightly at the edge and stamped, not with an emperor's profile, but with something unmistakable. A turnip. You turn it over. On the back, the faint imprint of crossed stalks. No letters, no denomination. Just symbolism, bold and strange. Later you ask Gaius about it. He squints. Ah, theater tokens. They use them for plays or sometimes food distributions. There was a whole satirical troupe that used turnip tokens as entry passes. Very subversive. Very rooty. You raise an eyebrow. Subversive vegetables. He shrugs. Historians still argue whether satire was permitted or merely tolerated, but either way it found clever disguises. You tuck the token into your satchel, another little artifact, another whisper from the past. As you stroll through the campus martius, you find yourself surrounded by young scholars in animated discussion. One of them, draped in a saffron tunic too long for him, is waving a wooden stylus and shouting. But if the turnip feeds the army and the army maintains the peace, then the turnip is civilization. His companion, chewing absently on a reed pen, mutters, "Tell that to the Senate." You keep walking. On the edge of the square, an elderly woman sits beneath a canopy of woven rushes. Her table is filled with small clay figures, household charms, tokens, miniature lairs, and peanuts. But there in the corner are 5 turnips, each one carved, each one unique. You pick one up. It has a little smile, a tilt of the head. It looks vaguely like a senator trying to apologize for something that absolutely was his fault. "Protection from bland meals," she says with a wink. You laugh. She adds, "Also keeps the neighbors jealous. They think I have divine connections." You buy one. You name it quietly Senator Blandius. Back at the villa, Gaius is sketching something in his notebook. You ask what? A calendar, he replies, but not one of emperors or lunar cycles, one of meals. He shows you columns of days, each labeled not with dates, but dishes. Turnip soup, pickled greens, spiced mash, root loaf. A week of sustenance told not by stars, but by what simmered in the pot. It's how my mother kept time, he says, not by solstice, but by smell. You nod, touched in a way you didn't expect. There's a quiet dignity to it, a life measured in spoons and ladles and gardens and pantry jars. Not because the stars don't matter, but because dinner always comes first. Evening begins to hint at the sky, a pale orange that leans softly into purple. You take the calendar and add your own line. Turnip tart, experimental, potentially criminal. Gaius laughs. Then, you ever wonder if any of this will last? You look around. The tablet with your bad sketch. The spoon resting in a clay bowl. The soft candlelight brushing the etched figures on the oil lamp. The little clay turnip now resting atop a scroll. Maybe not all of it, you say, but enough. Enough to matter. You smile, enough to remind. And that's the thing. History is loud in the monuments, but it lingers in the corners. In the things too quiet for statues. In the things that get passed from hand to hand, meal to meal, joke to joke. A root, a recipe, a whispered superstition, a child's toy. A token stamped with something unimportant and yet not. As the light fades, you and Gaius light a small fire in the courtyard brazier. Not for warmth, but for ambiance. He slices apples. You brew tea. The turnip tart, once a threat, is now a reality and surprisingly edible. You raise your cup. He raises his. The fire crackles softly between you. To the root, he says. To the ridiculous, you reply. You sip. The tea is hot. The sky is dark. The garden hums with evening insects and the faint creak of vine-heavy trellises. Tomorrow you might visit a shrine, or interview a cook, or simply stay here and write turnip sonnets for the amusement of the cat. But tonight you've learned something about endurance, about humor, about the way a humble vegetable might, in its own way, thread a line through centuries. It won't be carved in marble, but maybe it doesn't have to be. You wake the next morning to the smell of honeyed oats and thyme. Not a feast, just enough. Always just enough. Gaius is already up, of course, feeding scraps to a pigeon that refuses to leave. He mumbles something about taxidermy and gives it a name. Probably Magistrate Pecus. You're not sure it's earned that yet. After breakfast, you spend some time cataloging your week. Not in dates or deeds or victories, but in roots. The wax charm. The carved lion. The turnip token. The recipe scroll. The ink pot. The shrine root. And, of course, Distinguisha. Your faithful, slightly soft companion, now settled in a clay dish by the window, gazing out like she owns the city. You take one last walk. Down streets you know by scent now. Past bakers who wave. Past the soap merchant who still insists you owe him a poem. Past the public fountain where Agrippa the turnip once wore a toga and knew Latin. You nod respectfully. And you arrive finally at a garden near the edge of the Aventine. A quiet place. A bench beneath a fig tree. A little plaque on the wall that says, in chipped Latin, "Roots run deep." You sit, you breathe, and you set the carved turnip token beside you just for a moment. Because this isn't the end of the journey. Not really. It's just one of those pauses that ancient cities are so good at, where time folds, where memory stirs, where everything feels quiet enough for meaning to settle. You think of Flava and her shrine. You think of Tulia and her stubborn crop rows. You think of the auctioneer, the baker, the scribe who hated turnips, and the boy who yelled Turnipus Maximus like he meant it. And most of all, you think about the unassuming things. The background players. The kind of object that doesn't beg for attention, but given enough time earns it. Historians still argue whether the turnip mattered in the grand scheme of empire. But you've seen how it fed armies, inspired jokes, soothed bellies became gifts, relics, satire, and sustenance. You've watched it pass from dirt to dish to dream. And maybe that's enough. More than enough. Back at the villa, you find Gaia sketching something new. A diagram of root vegetables ranked by dramatic narrative potential. You ask where the turnip ranks. Somewhere between unwilling hero and philosopher in disguise, he replies, fair. You both sit in the shade. There's no grand climax, no climactic revelation. Just the soft crackle of a lamp, the rustle of olive leaves, the quiet clink of cups. And then finally the day exhales. The sun drops. The sky glows. And for a moment you just swear that the turnip beside you gives the faintest nod of approval. Now let's ease you into a slower rhythm. Just before sleep, your mind drifts away from the worn stones of Rome, from the laughter in gardens and the faint scent of pickled roots. You imagine the soil, soft and rich, cradling the humble vegetables that have weathered centuries. No fanfare, no monument. Just quiet resilience. The turnip doesn't shine, it doesn't sing, but it stays. It feeds, it returns. Like memory, like breath. Let your thoughts soften now. Let them trail into warm fields, into flickering torchlight, into clay bowls gently steaming on a worn wooden table. You've walked far, learned much, and now you rest wrapped in the small, steady comfort of old stories and stubborn roots. Close your eyes. The garden waits. The turnip watches. And you dream.